All right, good morning and welcome to all of our attendees. Thank you for joining us today. My name is John Muthersbaugh, and I serve as New York State DEC's Construction General Permit or CGP coordinator out of our DEC central office in Albany. Today's webinar, the purpose of it, our intent for today is to provide the public with guidance specific to meeting the 2025 CGP requirements on solar projects. For the registration questions for this webinar, we kind of queried all the attendees on just familiarity with the program, and most of the attendees' responses were that they're familiar with the CGP program in general and the permit. If you're not, we have a separate webinar that we gave earlier this year that kind of covers the basics of the permit and a lot more information about the permit and the program on our stormwater permit for construction activity webpage, which you can check out. But today's webinar is much more specific to solar development. And like I said, the majority of our attendees seem familiar with the program and the permit. So that's good. So this webinar today, we're hosting it as Division of Water staff. So I mentioned my name. We also have Julie Melanson on the line, who's our section chief of our DEC's Green Energy Management section, or GEMS. And Ben Fiorisi is on the line, who also works in GEMS. And Julie and Ben played a central role in developing the solar presentation that will be given today. And we also have Carrie Buteau from DEC Region 4 and Luke Scannell from DEC Region 8. And Carrie and Luke also played a pivotal role in developing the solar presentation, and they have significant experience serving as DEC regional staff, implementing the CGP program, including SWIP reviews, site inspections, and so on. And we are recording this event, and special thanks to our Division of Communications colleagues who are helping us to put on this webinar and record it and provide the WebEx technical assistance if you need help with that. So along with recording the actual webinar that we're sharing on the screen and are speaking with it, we will also be posting the slide deck on our webpage after today's webinar once all that material is ready. And I sent out emails using our Stormwater Info email account, alerting people about this. Please reach out to us if you'd like to be added to that mailing list. We do use that occasionally to spread the word of events like this and other information specific to the CGP program. So on this slide today, this is our agenda for today. Next up will be the solar development presentation, and Julie Melanson will really spearhead that effort, giving that presentation today. She'll be the primary speaker, and other panelists may chime in as needed. And near the end of that, we'll be providing some contact information, and be happy to go over that when we get to that point. And after the presentation, we'll take about a 5-minute break before doing a Q&A session. And Ben Fiorisi will be moderating that Q&A session. We'll be reading out the questions, and then our different panelists will help answer any questions that come in. I believe you should be able to submit questions like now and going forward during the presentation, and then certainly during the Q&A session as well. So feel free to use the chat to do that. All questions will be coming in by chat, and only the panelists will be able to unmute themselves and speak. So again, this will be recorded. The slide deck will be provided. All of that will be posted to the webpage. And I plan to make another announcement using our CGP announcements mailing list once that's available. And I believe that kind of covers the logistics at this point. So I'll gladly turn it over to Julie to take us away on the presentation.
Thank you, John.
Yeah, thanks, Julie.
Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes, you're good.
Okay, perfect. So I see there are a lot of people on today. I see a lot of familiar faces here. So welcome, everybody. Please make sure you put your questions in the chat as the questions arise, and so that way we can get them all addressed at the end. So first of all, I just want to say we have some guiding principles that we used when we were developing the construction general permit conditions for solar facilities. You may be familiar with the solar panel construction stormwater permitting and SWIP guidance that was issued back in April of 2018. And that memo took really two scenarios and put them forth for people to try to achieve to manage their stormwater on site. But what happened was that memo didn't really cover every solar installation scenario. There was a lot of gray area. And stormwater best practices and research kind of have evolved since then. So when it was time for the construction general permit update, we replaced the 2018 solar memo with the provisions in the construction general permit. So that way we would have some more clarity and more consistency statewide for the implementation of the construction general permit for solar energy construction sites. This graphic John pulled together, and it talks a little bit about the design manual for our technical standards as well as our solar specific guidance. So as you can see here, the 2018 memo has officially gone away. There was a supplement to the 2018 memo called the NYSDEC letter, and the NYSDEC letter was basically back and forth between New York Solar Energy Industries Association staff and colleagues and DEC, and that has kind of gone away as well. And we're just relying on the solar guidance in the new construction general permit and this presentation to give information going forward. So if you have that 2018 memo, you can just toss that out and just refer to the permit going forward. And we want to keep a couple of things in mind when we're considering designing solar facilities. We want the solar facilities to be designed and constructed to promote sheet flow and infiltration underneath and in between the rows of solar panels. We want to address compaction on solar sites. Soil decompaction restoration may be required. There's a lot of heavy equipment moving across these sites, in between the rows, up and down the roadways. And then solar project sites, like all the other sites covered in the construction general permit, they need to be stable, and discharges on solar project sites need to be non-erosive. So that doesn't change for solar sites. And then when we're looking at Appendix B, tables 1 and 2, we're really isolating out solar array field areas versus other areas on site. So the scenarios in this training only apply to the solar array field area of the project. Okay, so that means the rows of panels, the inner row spaces, the surrounding buffer areas. It does not include traditional impervious areas like buildings, substation pads, and roadways. We came up with this diagram so that we could all use the same words when we're talking about solar facilities. I'm not going to get into it too much right now. Oops, geez Louise, sorry guys. Not going to get into it too much, but just that way we recognize, you know, there are gaps between the solar tables and the solar modules, and then the inner row spaces and the solar table width. This is just like a list of definitions that we use when we're referring to them, so that, like, again, we can all be talking, use the same language when we're talking about solar array field areas. So if you have traditional impervious areas on site, the SWIP has to address post-construction stormwater management controls for those areas of the project. If you're looking for relief from designing post-construction practices for these areas, there are some approved alternatives such as limited use pervious access roads and alternative stormwater management practices for substations, and they can achieve sizing criteria and reduce post-construction practices. But in general, traditionally impervious areas need to be managed, have their post-construction stormwater managed. And if you might be familiar with this, for pre-development conditions, designers use a curve number that corresponds to the existing conditions. The exception is that when the pre-development land use is ag, the curve number for the pre-developed condition can be taken as meadow, and that's as per the Stormwater Management Design Manual. For post-construction conditions, if the project, so I'm going to talk a lot about Appendix B tables 1 and 2. So what the takeaway from Appendix B is that's the section that tells you what type of controls you need for your project. So the Appendix B Table 1 are projects that only need a SWIP that addresses erosion and sediment controls. Table 2 includes projects that need post-construction stormwater management. So for projects that meet Appendix B Table 1 conditions, the solar panels are considered disconnected impervious area, and the curve number for meadow can be used for that solar array field area. In the case of agrivoltaics, pasture or row crops may be used to more accurately reflect on the post-construction land use, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more later. So if the project meets Appendix B Table 2 conditions, the solar panels are considered connected impervious area, and the SWIP has to include post-construction stormwater practices for those areas. If you want to, a downstream analysis can be conducted to determine if post-construction quantity controls for the 10 and 100-year events are needed, and the information for that is in the design manual, section 4.10. So now we're going to focus on those projects that only need erosion and sediment controls. So 8% slope maximum and will not alter the hydrology. That's one of the criteria. So the solar array field areas designed and constructed in accordance with these criteria are met, then they only need to use erosion and sediment controls, like I stated. So the 8% slope maximum and is not going to alter the hydrology. Panels have to be elevated off the ground. And when we talk about this, some people say, well, what does it mean to be elevated off the ground surface? And what the target is your well-established vegetative cover under the panels. So if the panels aren't sufficiently elevated off the ground to allow post-construction ground surface consisting of a well-established vegetative cover, and when we talk about that, we're talking about final stabilization definition in Appendix A of the Construction General Permit. So then it has to be considered connected impervious area for the hydrology analysis, and the SWIP has to address post-construction stormwater management controls designed in accordance with the sizing criteria in Chapter 4 or Chapter 10 for the East of Hudson watershed. So really, your height is dependent. If it's high enough, it depends on what vegetation is coming in below it. If you have agrivoltaics, you're probably going to need to have higher posts for your panels. And then if you're just having grass, just make sure it's elevated enough to get your grass growing. Panels have to be spaced one table width apart. So that way stormwater can flow off the down gradient side of the panels and continuous sheet flow across the ground surface. And this is based in the design manual section 5.3.2 and 5.3.4. We also have a diagram that we'll show in a little bit about the inner row space requirements. So panel spacing is really consistent with the concept of disconnection of impervious areas, and it's really an important component to consider when avoiding erosive conditions. So disconnection can be achieved through adequate spacing of the rows over areas of well-established vegetative cover. If your inner row space requirements are insufficient, the infiltration is less likely, resulting in panels that are more likely to create concentrated flow paths and perform as impervious. So for solar array field areas that have insufficient spacing for infiltration, the disconnection credit for runoff reduction would not be applicable. And that, as a result, the SWIP would need to address post-construction stormwater management control practices. So for the designer to meet the intent of disconnection, the design should consider the largest solar panel width, considering all rotations and positions, and provide that width as the minimum spacing down gradient of every row of solar panels in the solar array field area. And we want applicants to consider the most conservative or design limiting position for the panels when determining how your standards are going to be implemented. If you have rotating panels, you have to, I'm actually going to show you this next slide. So if you're using rotating panels, you have to have, they're not, solar trackers aren't considered disconnected impervious area unless they meet the criteria. The SWIP has to demonstrate that the site conditions and placement of solar panels will allow for disconnection and achieve runoff reduction objectives of the construction general permit in order to apply the area reduction credit for the panels in all positions. So you can see that the solar table width here, like if this is a fixed panel, that's the maximum width. But if it was a rotating panel, you know, if it went more parallel to the surface, it would have a wider width. So we also want to make sure we're not altering the hydrology from pre to post development conditions. So what we refer to the definition of altering the hydrology, it's from Appendix A of the construction general permit. And it basically says the post-development peak flow rates have increased by more than 5% of the pre-developed condition for the design storm of interest. So the designers really need to perform the assessment and the hydrology analysis to make this determination. A lot of people got kind of hung up on the panels being parallel to the contour with the 2018 memo. We got rid of that requirement in the construction general permit because DEC recognizes that rows of solar tables are frequently constructed to track the sun's path and not along the contour. So the main intent of considering placement along the contour was to ensure that precipitation coming off the panels consists of sheet flow across the site. So practices that maintain sheet flow and promote infiltration are necessary to meet the construction general permit sizing criteria for water quality volume and runoff reduction volume. And all of this is to say that we want to make sure that the design doesn't result in concentrated flow and soil erosion. So even if they're not on the contour, and this is kind of reiterating, the site can still be designed for the area to allow to function as a pervious filter strip. The panels still have to be elevated, they have to be adequately spaced, they can't alter the hydrology, and you still have to have that well-vegetated surface. If you do all of these things, this meets the water quality volume and runoff reduction volume sizing criteria in the construction general permit for that portion of the solar array field area, just that portion. And since the panels are not treated as this is a question we had come up, I believe it was from NYSDEC, and it's since the panels aren't treated as connected impervious area, the 10-foot pre-treatment requirement isn't necessary for each row of tables. So we have some frequently asked questions we thought that we'd include here. So if the area below and between the rows of panels are constructed to act as a filter strip, do I claim that credit on the ENOI? So the answer to that is if the design meets the requirements that we talked about, the area below and between the panels is considered vegetated open space. And then how do I complete the ENOI when different solar array field areas within the same project meet both tables 1 and 2? So if some portions of the design have impervious areas, you fill out the ENOI to account for those. You only need to put the volumes that need to be treated and the actual volumes you're treating for the areas that fall under table 2. So let's talk about slope limitations. So the filter strip practice has slope limitations. They can only be used on slopes less than or equal to 8% to make sure that sheet flow is maintained. If you have slopes greater than 8%, there is an alternative. You can design and implement permanent engineered practices from the Blue Book and the design manual, or use the DEC gravel diaphragm detail, which I'll show you in a little bit, along the slope or the contour to reestablish and maintain sheet flow, which is considered to meet the RRV and WQV. If you, so just keep in mind that the key is sheet flow. Or where sheet flow can't be maintained, consider the panels in that area to be connected impervious area and design post-construction stormwater management control practices to provide the water quality and quantity controls for that portion of the solar array field area. So some other design elements used on other sites for runoff reduction volume and water quality volume, they include gravel diaphragms, level spreaders, and flow diffusers. We have had facilities come to us with designs for earthen dikes. We've seen some in practice, and they've generally been shown not to be effective in maintaining sheet flow, as they're not really a practice intended for that use, and they have their own set of issues, including unintended ponding and traffic concerns when construction vehicles are going back and forth. They can weaken those earthen dikes and cause places for concentrated flow to overtop them. So here is our gravel diaphragm diagram. And there are some notes that go along with it. Basically, they want to be placed on the contour to reestablish that sheet flow. They have a specific spacing used to make sure that there's not too much of a run between diaphragms, so that there's not real erosion starting up in between the two. One thing of note is one of the things that we've noticed is if these aren't protected during construction, they can get plugged up with silt before things even get started. So to prevent excess silt and debris during construction, it's recommended to leave the excess fabric to fold over the diaphragm from the up gradient side. And then you can remove that once everything is stabilized. So what are the takeaways here? We want to make sure that you design these so that they're stable. So when the project can achieve panels elevated off the ground surface and rows of panels have adequate spacing and sheet flow is maintained and there's no change in hydrology, no other practices are required to address the water quality volume and runoff reduction requirements for the solar array field area. You can just do erosion and sediment controls and quantity controls if needed. So Appendix B, Table 2, when do you need a full SWIP? Okay, well, if you have slopes greater than 8% and you can't maintain sheet flow, if you have slopes less than 8%, but you're going to alter the hydrology, or if you have panels spaced closer than one table width apart, or you have ground mounted tables that don't allow for that establishment of the 80% vegetative cover, and all traditional impervious areas included with the solar development. So if your slopes are greater than 8%, you're generally along the contour. You can, like we said before, design and implement permanent practices from the Blue Book, the design manual, or use the gravel diaphragm that are going to maintain sheet flow and meet the runoff reduction volume and water quality volume requirements. Or if you can't maintain sheet flow, then you need to design post-construction practices that provide the runoff reduction volume and water quality volume for that portion of the solar array field area. And the modeling is with those areas as connected impervious. If you have slope greater than 8%, again, so reiterating that you can reestablish and maintain sheet flow, or if you can't, you're going to design post-construction stormwater management control practices to provide water quality and quantity treatment for that portion of the solar array field area. Assuming the panels are connected impervious. If just a note here, if you use the gravel diaphragm along the contour to meet the water quality volume and runoff reduction volume requirements, but the requirements for channel protection volume QP and QF must be met with a different practice. So unlike conventional construction projects where you have your elevated panels, your rows are spaced well and sheet flows maintained, the area under the panels will function as vegetated open space. No other practices would be required to address water quality volume and runoff reduction volume requirements for that solar array field area. So you can have a full SWIP that does not require water quality volume and runoff reduction volume for solar array field areas that meet that criteria. Quantity controls from chapter 4 of the design manual must also be addressed unless one of the waiver criteria from chapter 4 can be applied. So spacing, the intent behind the inner row space is to ensure that water quality is protected and runoff reduction volume is met. If you don't have that minimum spacing, the panels do have to be considered connected impervious area, and post-construction stormwater management control practices are going to be required. So as a summary, here's where you need a basic SWIP, here's where you need a full SWIP. Just keep these in mind. This is a great summary to keep in kind of in your back pocket. Now, we've talked a little bit about some optional tools for solar sites. We want to get into that a little more. I did notice there was a question in the chat about limited use pervious access roads. So maybe we can, I didn't see exactly what the question said, but you know, maybe this would answer some of the questions. It's very important that you recognize that limited use pervious access roads are not required for solar sites. There's no mandate that says you have to use this. And in fact, the limited use pervious access road is not really suitable for all sites. It can only be used if the following criteria have been met. So they can't be utilized during construction. They can't be temporarily covered with fabric and stone or any other materials during construction. They can't be used as a runoff reduction practice, runoff reduction volume practice for the other impervious areas on the site. For the hydrology analysis, the road has to match pre-development conditions. And the design and construction needs to comply with all of the notes in the details. Okay. Let me just go through these notes. So here's some other examples of limitations. There are slope limitations. Cross slopes can't exceed 6%, and the longitudinal slope shouldn't exceed 15%. And if you use them during construction, it may impact soil or other conditions that require testing and reconstruction to be effective as a pervious feature. And many sites don't have enough available area to construct both temporary and permanent roads in separate footprints. And it can't be constructed or used until all areas subject to runoff onto the road have achieved final stabilization. So, and one more thing to note is these are not permeable pavers or permeable asphalt, and they shouldn't be treated or modeled that way. We also have an alternative substation design that was developed by EDR. Those systems provide treatment and manage of the water quality volume, runoff reduction volume, and channel protection volume in the QP and Q. I think that's supposed to be QF. By providing storage and infiltration of all rain events up to and including the 100-year storm. It has to comply with chapters 5 and 6 of the design manual not to be considered a deviation. So what that means is you still have to consider things like separation to bedrock and groundwater, and the minimum width of a riparian buffer or filter strip is 50%. or 50 feet, sorry. And then some people have asked us what the sizing calculations are needed for the alternative substation design. And calculations are only required when additional drainage areas are directed to the substation. So here's this snapshot of the substation section. In this one, there's one for an infiltration rate of less than half an inch an hour, or sorry, greater than half an inch an hour. There's infiltration rate less than half an inch an hour. And then there's also the filtering version, not the infiltration version that the previous two were. And one thing of note, I just wanted to say before I forget that DC is working on a catalog of practices, of alternative practices to be that we're going to be putting together and making available on our website. Okay, scarified road detail. For upland roads and work areas, this is especially useful on utility lines. It's not really suitable for wetlands or ag areas, and it's meant for really minimal intermittent use. It's definitely not intended to ensure access for emergency vehicles. It just doesn't have the load-bearing capacity. And there's flexibility in modeling these in TR 55. If they're mostly vegetated, they can be considered a pervious surface. If they're more like a farm road, they can be modeled as a dirt road. You just use your best professional judgment when you're doing your calculations. So during construction, the access road consists of gravel. Post-construction, they bring in 6 inches of topsoil and scarify and seed and mulch. And these roads get really well vegetated. They have reasonably good infiltration. Like I said before, they're really useful for utility lines. National Grid and CHGE are using them currently. And then we have the detail that we're going to add to the catalog of practices. Okay, flow diffusers. So DC acknowledges that well-designed projects on slopes steeper than 10% have successfully implemented some of the alternative practices mentioned, such as flow diffusers and stone diaphragms. And this flow diffuser details from from Marathon Engineering. It's been applied on several sites. If there are instances that trigger 60-day review, just note that it'll aid in review if you can provide examples of previous projects that this practice has been approved on. So the flow diffusers provide additional attenuation to reduce runoff rates. You can stagger them beneath the panels to catch the water leaving the panels and slow it down while avoiding most of the drive aisles for construction. When they're used to treat the water quality volume for the panels, the designer sizes the storage volume of the flow diffuser sump to hold the calculated incremental water quality volume of the contributing panel sub area flowing into each diffuser. When you're looking at the sump, you can calculate that using the applicable water quality volume equations in the design manual. You just have to assume the panels in the portion of the contributing solar array field area are impervious, connected impervious for the purposes of sizing the sump. And then maximum flow diffuser spacing is the same as water bar spacing in the blueprint. And here's the detail for that flow diffuser. So when sizing these practices for the water quality volume, calculate the percent impervious by looking at the solar table width over the solar table width plus the interrow space width. Now we wanted to put in some additional considerations for these sites. A lot of these sites have other activities going on, especially if you're considering large scale renewables. So we want to make sure there's no double dipping on stormwater management practices. So for example, your vegetated filter strips, treating stormwater runoff from access roads can't start under the panels themselves. And areas in the solar array field area use this filter strip can't start until after the final row, inter-row space. There are additional DEC resources that you can look to. For example, you can consult the Division of Water's Bureau of Flood Protection and Dam Safety's floodplain management guidelines for solar array and wind farm projects. If you're considering a solar project in a floodplain, Division of Materials Management also has their DMM4, which is the photovoltaic solar projects at closed land solid waste landfills program policy. If you're considering a landfill project. Decompaction. So a lot of sites struggle with decompaction, when it can take place and the order of operations to make sure that you know, you're not disturbing anything that's any electrical lines that have already been laid or things like that. So heavy use areas such as laydown yards and temporary access roads need to be decompacted to 12 inches or 18 inches in agricultural areas. Traffic areas between the rows of solar panels need to be decompacted to 6 inches or the depth of the topsoil layer, whichever is greater. At the end of the project, if you can't push a 3/8 inch metal bar 12 inches into the soil with just your body weight, you haven't done enough. And if your solar array field area falls under table 2, which means you need a full SWIP and no decompaction is performed, then the designer needs to go up one hydrologic soil group for modeling and provide water quality volume treatment for those areas. So for example, if you are in A soils, it would be B soils. If you were in B soils, it would be C soils, and so on. We get a lot of questions about dewatering. So the construction general permit only allows for discharges of clean water. If soil or groundwater contamination exists, or a polymer or other water treatment chemical is used, then you have to hold and haul or apply for an individual speedies permit. And if you're going to apply for an individual speedies permit, that's really going to have impacts on your project timeline. It takes about a year to get an individual speedies permit. So if you are working in areas of contaminated soil or groundwater, and you know you're going to do a large volume of dewatering, you really need to consider your options if you're going to have, you know, frac tank upon frac tank of water hauled away, or if you're going to treat it on site. Oh, and this is important too. If a treatment system is proposed, so say you have like a package plant or something you're going to put on site to separate out the fines from the water, your discharge still needs to get an individual speedies permit, because we need to make sure that the discharges don't have any residual chemicals left. So what is contaminated? We could have a whole day discussion on just what is contaminated. But these are some of the guidelines. Region 2, which is New York City, is unique in that it's assumed that all soil and groundwater are contaminated based on historical knowledge and information. So when a dewatering application comes in, ask the applicant, or the applicant should submit the calculated radius of influence and look up any sites with historical contamination within the radius of influence. Let's see. And then dewatering. Another thing to consider is whether you're going to need a water withdrawal permit for your dewatering. These are just the criteria here. So if you are on Long Island, you might need a Long Island well permit. You might need a water withdrawal permit if you're going to be doing more than 69.4 gallons per minute or 3 million gallons in any 30-day period in all other New York counties. Let's see. Dust control, use of polymers. DOT has an approved list of polymers for dust control on their website, and there are only 5 products on it. These are the 5 products, so we'll share those with you. A lot of renewable energy projects have horizontal directional drilling associated with them. And it's, again, the CGP only allows for the discharge of clean, uncontaminated stormwater. Discharge of other waste or wastewaters, including drilling fluids and contaminated groundwater, are not authorized. The Division of Environmental Permits, their central office's Bureau of Energy Project Management, is developing specifications for the development of an inadvertent return plan. And my section GEMS is working on a checklist for a review of HDD and IR plans to make sure that they meet the minimum requirements. Plans should always include disposal plans for the fluids and collected solids after the work is completed. It's really important. We're finding some sites that are trying to dispose of this material on site. On-site disposal is not allowed without prior approval from Division of Water and Division of Materials Management for seeker projects, or DPS for large-scale renewable projects that would go under like the Article 10, 94C, Article 7. Well, solar projects aren't Article 7, 10 or 94C, or the new Article 8. And then you really need to have a sound frac out plan, including keeping frac tanks and back trucks on site during drilling activities in case there is an issue. Division of Water is no longer requiring the review and approval of water treatment chemical notification forms, provided there's no intended discharge. We're just requesting the applicants notify us of the use of drilling fluids and make their best effort to obtain toxicity data. Complete forms need to be included as part of the HDD or IR plan. Again, if there's an intent to discharge drilling fluids to a water body, review or approval of the water treatment chemical notification forms are needed, including toxicity data for the chemical, and a speedies permit may also be required for the discharge. Let's see, if an inadvertent return happens, the material has to be recovered and held and hauled, or you need an individual speedies permit for disposal. If you're proposing a treatment system to treat the water before discharging, that still requires a speedies permit, like we said, because we need to make sure all the residual chemicals are not discharged. And a working group has been put together to come up with a response protocol that loops in all the necessary divisions here at DEC when an inadvertent return happens. When an inadvertent return is identified, on-site environmental monitors are required to report it to a single point of contact, which is the Division of Environmental Permits, Bureau of Energy Project Management, and Central Office. I'm not going to get too far into the weeds on this, though. So really what we want you to keep in mind, this is from my boss. He's a big Spider-Man fan. With great power comes great responsibility. We really want to see these projects succeed in the most environmentally conscious way practicable. And sometimes, honestly, minimums aren't enough. You need to beef up your plans to make sure you don't have a release, and make sure you consider your site conditions and make sound choices. I want to take some time to thank our working group, our solar working group. It consists of myself, John Muthersbaugh, Luke Scannell, Carrie Buteau, Natalie Brown, Steve Rose, Michelle LaFay, Brian Nicholson, Chris LePan, and Ben Furisi. And for us to contact us, reach out if you have a project specific question. Contact the DEC region where your site is located. You can go on the DEC website and find what region that you're in and call the Division of Water so that you can get directed to the staff that covers your county where your project is. If you have questions specifically for the construction general permit, you can contact DEC Central Office. And overall construction general permit questions can go to John. If you have questions about large-scale renewable energy generation and transmission projects, you can reach out to me or Ben, or you can also reach out to the general GEMS mailbox. So that is the end of our presentation. We're going to take a 5-minute break. So what time is it now? It is 10:50. So let's try to be back by 10:55. Thank you, everybody. Okay, it is 10:55. Um, our panelists, uh, our panelists back from their break?
I'm here, Julie.
I'm here.
I'm here.
Great. Okay, so I think the way that we're going to do this Q&A is, Ben is going to read the question from the chat, and the panel will take turns answering the questions. So Ben, do you want to fire away with the first question?
Sure, yeah. I don't think this is directly related to the content, but someone asked if this is PDH eligible, which I don't believe so, correct?
No, it is not.
Okay. So next question is, when will mitigation be required if a proposed access road does not exceed the 0.25 acres of disturbance threshold? Do we still need to mitigate on site?
The 0.25 threshold?
Yeah. If a proposed access road doesn't exceed the 0.25 acres of disturbance threshold.
I'm wondering if they mean, if they are talking about wetland mitigation, or because for the quarter acre. Oh, it's a wetlands question. Okay, yeah, we're not wetland staff, so it's, we're not, I mean, unless anybody on the panel has that knowledge, we're Division of Water staff, not BEH, so I don't think we can answer that question.
And Julie, just to clarify, BEH is
Bureau of Ecosystem Health, yep.
in our DEC Division of Fish and Wildlife. Is that correct?
Yeah, I just know them as BEH.
Right. I think it's Division of Fish and Wildlife, and we are Division of Water staff.
Thanks to them.
Yep.
All right, next question.
Sure, yeah. Can you address the requirements of the limited use pervious access roads and what you all have seen as far as the use of caps during construction to mitigate the compaction concerns?
Yeah, what we're trying to do is not allow use of the pervious access roads during construction. So capping them or things like that is not preferred. Luke, do you have anything you'd want to add to that?
Yeah, so I had a large solar project that installed these caps on the roads, and when they backed through and tested to see if it did protect them from compaction, it did not, right? The underlying soils were significantly compacted. They didn't try and argue with us or make any case that they weren't compacted, and are going through and restoring all the roads anyway. So it doesn't really work as far as what we're trying to protect them from. It does prevent like dirt from getting mixed into the road, but if we're going to have to go back and decompact it to allow that infiltration, keep it a porous surface, then that's not something that we're encouraging because it hasn't worked on other projects.
Okay, next question.
All right. What is insufficient spacing in regard to fixed and tilt deck panels?
Okay, so insufficient spacing means they're closer than one table width apart. And when we're talking about rotating panels, it means the widest possible configuration with the panels parallel to the ground surface. If they're fixed tilt, there's, it's just is what it is. But with the rotating panels, it's the widest width.
Julie, I'm wondering, would you be willing to share the slide with the
Yeah,
diagram?
let me try to do
Yeah.
that. We go back.
Thanks, Julie.
Good point, John. I don't know what I did here to my geez Louise. I'm gonna stop sharing for a second and then start sharing again because I don't know what I did to my Um, mm, I don't think you can see what I'm seeing right now. Um, can you see me going back through the slides now?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Thanks, Julie.
Sorry, my screen is giving me fits. I'm doing this. There we go. So say these are fixed tilt panels. The solar table width is the width of the panel. If they're rotating panels, you know, and they can go perpendicular or parallel to the ground surface, the parallel is going to be the widest table width.
And Julie, if I just to chime in on this, I think you explained this already in the presentation, but this question and the required interrow space is one of the criteria to be considered a table 1 category, right? So
Yes.
it's not, we're not saying that solar development can never vary from this. We're just saying if you want to be considered table 1, this is one of the criteria that you need to meet. Otherwise, if panels are placed closer than that, it would be one of the factors that bumps it to table 2 as far as the CGP requirements.
Thank you, John. Yep.
Yeah.
Next question.
Do these practices applied to project design and construction greatly impact decommissioning costs that may have been not understood in decommissioning plans negotiated during the previous guidelines?
I don't know the answer to that question. Would anybody else on the panel know the answer to that question?
Sure. This is Carrie Butone, Region 4. What we saw when we had Article 10 solar projects getting constructed a few years ago is that projects frequently plan to use the pervious access roads during construction, and you know, some of them plan to convert them or restore them, others didn't. And, you know, we made it clear that, no, you actually have to restore the soil so that the water can infiltrate. And it did cost them a lot more money to restore the roads than what they had planned. So as we had projects that came a little bit later, we made it very clear that it's going to cost a lot of money that you didn't account for. So, you know, plan ahead, see if you can try to fit in post-construction practices, and they decided it was easier and less increase in expense to restore the roads than to try to fit in post-construction. But, you know, all the criteria for using those roads is laid out in the notes, and unfortunately, it hasn't been clearly discussed in the designs of the prior projects. I think more projects are aware now of the restrictions on the use of the roads, but it definitely resulted in a lot more costs, as not for decommissioning, but just getting the projects ready to operate. For decommissioning, I don't know how much more cost it'll be other than adding in, you know, the removal of like the gravel diaphragms and things like that that are being kind of added after the fact.
All right, thanks, Carrie. Someone asked if this presentation will be available to download, which yes, it will. Next question is, for some projects, I have seen us need to build basins in areas with tree clearing for solar. This still holds true, right?
Well, if you're going to change the hydrology, you need to account for that. I mean, Luke, what would you say to that?
It depends on what kind of basins we're talking about. If we're talking about like sediment basins, then a lot of projects need those based on the how much they're doing mass grading and the soil disturbances that are going on the site. If we're talking about detention basins, then yes, if they're changing the hydrology, often meeting if they have more than a 5% increase during the 10 or 100-year storm event, or if there's channel protection requirements they have to meet, then they would need to build a basin. This question specifically talks about tree clearing, and I'm not sure how tree clearing is tied to the need to build basins.
All right, well, if you were the person that had the question, if you want to expand on it further, please expand on it in the chat, and we'll just go on to the next question.
Great. Okay. Substation option stores water in the substation stone, right?
Yes, so there's two substation options. One is an infiltration, so the water gets temporarily stored in the stone, infiltrates into the soil. And the other is where it is temporarily detained in the stone and then is discharged through perforated under drains to a level spreader and filter strip. In both cases, it is temporarily stored within the stone below the substation. That is the reservoir course on the slide that Julie is showing.
Alrighty, great. I'm not sure what this is referring to, but somebody said, how was your talk on Friday? Did you get any answers on LTIP that we didn't?
I'm not sure what that refers to.
Yeah, I'm not either. I'm not sure if whoever put that question in the chat would like to clarify. But for now, I'll just move on to the next one, which is when will this catalog of practices be ready?
I'm not sure if Cam is on, but we were aiming for fall of 2025.
Great. How do we get a copy of the solar development slides?
Yeah, so I plan to send another announcement using our CGP announcements mailing list once we have this recording and the slide deck available on our CGP webpage, which is the Stormwater Permit for Construction Activity DEC webpage. So again, if you'd like to be on that mailing list and you're not already, please reach out to me or to our Stormwater Info email account. I'm happy to add you to that mailing list so you get updates like that.
Thanks, John. What if the site is D-soils?
So I think this refers to compaction.
Yes, I think so.
Yeah, there's a question that echoes that shortly thereafter that expands on that question.
Yeah, it says, does an existing D-soils need to be modeled as D-soils in proposed, or does it need to be degraded to a bare soil? And then in parentheses, if soils compaction is not met for various reasons. And then the person said they received conflicting direction on this.
Luke, do you have the answer in your back pocket for that one?
So I typically tell designers that if they're compacting D-soils, they would model them as compacted dirt roads, which is a curve number of 89.
Great, okay. So the next question is,
We did get a clarification on the woods, which is that going from woods to meadow, woods in good condition in Class D soils is 79 and meadow is 78. So when we're clearing woods and creating meadow, we are essentially reducing the curve number, meaning that we would need to provide runoff controls. And so yeah, that if we did so if we are clearing woods and creating meadow, we are going to be increasing runoff, and we might need a detention basin depending on how much woods we cleared in order to bring those peak flows back to existing conditions. So the answer is yes, we may need to build basins or some other type of control measure in that case.
All right, ready for the next one?
Yep.
All right. Should we be establishing pre-construction compaction testing of a representative sample of the site and require testing post-construction?
I'm wondering if they mean before installation of a temporary or a permeable access road, or if they're talking about the site in general. Generally, we see with traffic lanes going in between the panels, we see light compaction in between the panels with trucks going up and down. We see more compaction on like the main travel areas. I'm not sure
So
if they're going to be doing if they're going to be doing deep ripping and decompaction, then they wouldn't need to do the testing.
right, there's no specific level of compaction that, you know, triggers or exempts a site from needing restoration. One of the key things to look for is, are you getting the dense vegetation established, right? In heavily compacted soils, you're not going to get grass to grow there in that first season, right? You're going to plant grass and you'll still have bare soil because the roots can't penetrate into the soil. And so when you do seed your site, it'll very clearly highlight the areas that need to be decompacted.
All right. Next question is, if soil and groundwater quality is unknown, particularly with regards to PFAS, is there a requirement to test for PFAS? And if PFAS is detected, I'm assuming this requires hold and haul.
If there's no if there's no historic or spills or anything like that, or the soil is not doesn't groundwater doesn't have a sheen, soil doesn't have an odor, there's no reasonable expectation for contamination. PFAS in general, I would have to talk to our PFAS people and get an answer on that, unless somebody on the panel knows better than I do about PFAS. Okay.
I don't know specifically about PFAS, but the question in general about groundwater quality being unknown, we're kind of addressing this as statewide, generally speaking. Like Julie just said, if there isn't a known contamination or a known concern of a spill, and there's no indication of any contamination, then it's generally assumed to be uncontaminated. Generally speaking,
Unless you're in region
statewide.
2.
But
Yeah,
yes,
unless you're in
there's-
region 2 and everything
right.
is considered.
Right, and DEC's region 2 is New York City, so it's the opposite. In New York City, that area, we assume that it is contaminated groundwater unless it can be shown or demonstrated otherwise. Yeah.
All right, next question is, can we be provided with a copy of floodplain management guidelines for solar array and wind farm projects document mentioned earlier, along with the presentation download?
I plan to, because of that question, I'll make note to link that on our webpage with today's recording and the slide deck once they're available.
Great, thank you. Next question is, DMM4 appears to contain stormwater review by the Materials Management Division. Does work on brownfields fall under the general permit / require a SWIP, or would solar projects solely be reviewed by Materials Management?
John, I think maybe you can cover that with the FAQ on brownfields.
Yeah, sorry, I'm reading over the question. So, stormwater review, materials management division. Okay, yeah. So if DMM, Division of Material Management, is involved and it's a brownfield site that they are working with, then that site, that activity that's kind of under the review of DMM does not require CGP coverage.
But don't they have to have a
Well,
specific plan?
So let me,
during the, go ahead, Luke.
so the remedial work, which is the proposed remedial action plan for remedial action plan, has to meet the intents of the construction general permit, and it will it'll develop a SWIP, it'll have all the plans and erosion sediment controls, and it will submit a notice of intent for informational purposes only. It doesn't actually get permit coverage, it doesn't pay a permit fee. And that is all handled under, that's for like DER if they're involved in that remediation. For materials management, I assume it's very similar because brownfields are kind of that crossover. The actual site improvements, where you're in, like whatever you're building on the site that wasn't there previously, is typically something that is covered under the construction general permit.
And I think maybe a different way to say what you're saying is the remedial work itself is what's covered, not putting in a solar facility wouldn't be considered remedial work because it's not remediating the site, like contamination. It's an additional use on the site. Is that accurate?
So yeah, the remedial work is what's covered by DMM/DER. The solar installation is what's covered by Division of Water.
Thanks, Luke. And just to clarify, if there's a department approved work plan, then they don't submit an informational ENOI for the CGP side of things. There's with the new 2025 ENOI form, there are eligibility questions related to that.
All right, so the next question is there a summary document on how the DEC requires IRs to be reported?
Not at this time. It is something that we're working on, but we don't have that document prepared for public use yet.
Okay, if solar sites are designed to limit disturbance with limited use pervious access road and post-mounted solar arrays, how is disturbance area determined to see if coverage under CGP is needed?
I typically tell designers it's the area they're working in because they may cause disturbances throughout that entire area. They probably won't disturb 100% of it, but they have to have coverage for anywhere there will be disturbances.
A distinction there, the limited use pervious access road is like putting that in, you're disturbing the soil. So that as far as do you need permit coverage or not under the CGP, that's just a simple question of, is the soil being disturbed? Where is it being disturbed? How much of it is being disturbed? And then using limited use pervious access road, if you meet all the criteria, like Carrie Buteau was mentioning, the detail has all the specifications of requirements to use it. If you meet all of those and use it, then you do not need to put in post-construction controls for that pervious access road.
Yeah, I think the second half of the question gets more at the determining whether coverage is needed, because I see a lot of designers who they're not proposing mass grading on a site. They're saying, okay, we're going to cause like 30% disturbance across the area in general. We're not disturbing all the soils, right? We're going to have a couple tracks going between the rows, and things are going to be dry, and we're not going to tear up the site. Well, it doesn't always work like that. Sometimes we have really wet conditions. Sometimes we disturb the site a lot more than we anticipate. And the coverage you're seeking should be conservative of that condition. So I recommend that they just say, this is the area that we're working, like this many acres we're working in. This is what we're, getting permit coverage to disturb, because we may end up disturbing all of that if things go really badly.
All right, next one is any other recommendations for requirements for municipalities to require for solar project to make sure they are in harmony with the land and existing hydrologic environment?
Well, I mean, in general, you want to design your site to meet pre-construction conditions for runoff. So, you're going to want to know things like, is there an existing flooding issue in the area? We had one site down in Portland County, and basically there was a known issue with flooding in the pre-developed condition downslope of the proposed facility. So they really took their time and examined their pre and post runoff conditions to make sure that they didn't exacerbate the existing condition. I'm not sure if that answers the question though.
I think that's a really good part of it. I'd also say that if there's natural flow paths through your site and you are proposing grading, then you're going to remove those natural drainage ways. You have to design somewhere for the water to go. How is it going to flow? Because it's going to recreate those if you don't give it a pathway.
And that's where we've seen a lot of sites have problems where they're near ready to terminate, but those pre-existing flow paths where they might not be a regulated stream, the water's still flowing through there and eroding, and they can't terminate until they get those stable. So, it's something that needs to be addressed in the early planning stages for sure. But I don't know how a municipality would require that other than making sure it's a project at the local level for review that they're meeting the CGP. And I guess the other thing too is that making sure that a municipality, if they have like a comprehensive plan for development, if they have areas where they would prefer to see solar or not, that might be another option if they want to have it in certain areas of their community.
Alrighty, next one is, in regards to the CGP Part 3 SWIP, a general SWIP requirements, it states that the owner or operator must consider the following risks due to climate change: increasing precipitation and increasing variability in precipitation, including change of drought. Has there been a standard for this that has been accepted for solar projects?
I don't know that there's been a standard, but I know different sites have been taking this into consideration. One of the sites I just recently worked on, they decided to oversize some of their post-construction practices to account for climate change. Has anybody else on the panel had anyone come to them about this?
I just had a pre-construction meeting, or not pre-construction, like an early design phase meeting with a project that was looking at doing exactly that, of increasing the storm size by 10%. But what I encourage designers in Western New York to consider is looking at a higher intensity of the short duration, high intensity events. So normally we size our conveyances for the 10-year, 24-hour storm, but we might want to look at a a higher intensity short-term event for sizing our conveyances, because that's what at least what I'm seeing out in this portion of New York State. That's kind of the failure, that things are getting stressed. In other parts of the state, it is much more that larger storm event where we have a long duration storm event, and the quantity controls are more important. So it really depends where in New York State you are, how you want to address that.
And then at a high level, just generally speaking, that reference from the permit is new in the 2025 version. And for more just kind of background on it, if you go to the fact sheet on our CGP webpage, for that same part, it kind of talks about where that came from, the regulation kind of requiring that to be put in. And so right now, it as far as like a standard that's accepted, that the requirement is simply a narrative consideration of those different factors, and that's the same whether it's a solar project or any project. It's required on any SWIP that needs for any project that needs coverage under the CGP right now, and more is expected to come in the future, but that is kind of a starting point. And again, that fact sheet language kind of gives the background on where that came from, and gives some other references for other guidance related to the regulations and different resources that could be useful when evaluating those risks.
Alrighty. You're saying about the alternative substation section that no calculations are needed unless additional drainage areas are directed to the substation. Could you elaborate on this? Typically, drainage areas cover a larger area than just the proposed substation. Does tree clearing or for substation expansions not have an effect if we're clearing woods for a substation expansion? Could you give a scenario where there would be no calculations needed when using this alternative?
So we're talking about sizing the substation stone, right? The depth of stone media in the substation. And so when we're not directing any additional drainage areas to the substation, then the size that's in the detail already provided is sufficient to do that, right? We don't have to go through and say, this is the volume of rain that we're going to get, and this is the volume of storage we're providing, and this is how we show it's equal. But if we have if we have a 4-acre substation and we're directing 10 acres of upland area to it, we are going to have to make sure it's sized appropriately for all the runoff that's going to it.
Thanks, Luke. For the 3/8 inch metal bar test for decompaction, wouldn't this test rely heavily on the moisture content of the soils for this area?
It definitely does. When we were doing this for evaluating roads for restoration to install the pervious access road, they need to be done when the soil's at field capacity, about 24 hours after a good soaking rain, which you don't always have. The drier it is, the harder it's going to be. Some projects actually brought in a testing company with like a truck-mounted penetrometer to do the testing. But we followed, Penn State had a penetrometer methodology that we followed when we were doing it.
Thank you, Carrie. Can you talk about the separation required for stacked panels to reduce concentrated flow?
Can you repeat that, Ben? I didn't quite hear it.
Yeah. Can you talk about the separation required for stacked panels to reduce concentrated flow?
Stacked panels?
Stacked panels, yeah. I'm not sure.
I don't know what stacked panels means.
All right, I can move on to the next one if whoever asked that question would like to clarify. So the next question says, we've previously included a copy of the 2018 Maryland Guidance for Solar document as part of our SWIPs. Is this not necessary now that the GP covers solar development?
That's correct. It's no longer valid.
Alrighty. How are ballasted racking systems considered throughout both tables?
So ballasted racking systems, we see those a lot on sites that are over closed landfills. So I've also seen them proposed on like highly contaminated brownfields where they don't want to disturb the soil to place the panels. If they're just setting the baskets on top of the ground and they're not doing any vegetation removal or grading or anything like that, then there's no soil disturbance. It all comes down to soil disturbance. So
Great. Okay. Next question says, if we're converting, oh,
Can I
sorry.
go back to that? So let's assume there is soil disturbance and we're considering whether it's table 1 or table 2 of appendix B. I think that's what that question is looking at. If they do need a permit, there is soil disturbance, and we're in table 1 or table 2 and we have these ballasts, how does that affect it?
I think part of it, from what I've seen, is that the ballasted panels tend to be lower on the few sites that I've seen, like closer to the ground, and the vegetation has not been able to become well established. So in that regard, those may need additional treatment. I can't remember if it falls under table 1 or 2, but that's a big concern with the ballast that I've seen.
And I would imagine if the ballasts are resting on the ground surface, we would consider the ballast footprint to be impervious area, regardless of, assuming there was appropriate vertical distance for vegetation.
All right, ready for the next one? If we're converting from a temporary basin to a permanent detention basin and have other BMPs within that DA that are treating the water quality aspects, treating the water quality aspects, does it need to have the wet storage within that basin, or can it just outlet from the bottom of the detention basin?
That depends on the purpose of the basin. If it's trying to provide water quality volume treatment, like a stormwater pond, then it would need a wet storage area to provide water quality volume. If it's only providing quantity controls, then it doesn't need that, and it can be designed as a dry detention basin and discharged from the bottom of the basin.
All right, next question. Table 1 says solar array field areas that have tables elevated off the ground, spaced one table with apart, do not alter hydrology from pre to post development conditions, and address water quality volume and runoff reduction volume by maintaining sheet flow on slopes less than 8%. Is there some leeway with regard to the spacing requirement if slopes are significantly less than 8%, let's say 2%, for example? It seems that a less steep site could handle a higher ground cover ratio while still fulfilling the spirit of the table 1 requirements. Could you provide any guidance?
As far as I understand, there is no leeway on that requirement.
it's definitely not built into the permit anyway.
Alrighty. Are the alternative practices considered non-standard and therefore require longer review by DEC?
So are you saying 60-day review? I think they mean, do they require 60-day review?
I would assume so, but there's no further clarification.
That's the way I read it.
So that's no. So for example, the limited use pervious access road isn't a treatment practice, so it's not a non-standard practice in the design manual. It simply is a practice that means you don't need to provide treatment for that area, right? So it doesn't trigger the 60-day review criteria. Additionally, when using gravel diaphragms to maintain sheet flow, you're not providing water, you're not sizing them for water quality volume, and that doesn't trigger 60-day review criteria. The substation isn't in the design manual, and that is intended to treat an impervious area, so I imagine that would. And if you were using the gravel diaphragms as a treatment practice, I imagine that also would. So if they're being used to provide water quality volume treatment, then they are something that's not in the design manual. That would trigger that 60-day review. That's my understanding. Do you guys agree with that?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Next question is, do you have specific guidance on what seed mixes should be used for meadow vegetation?
No, there are some seed mixes recommended in the Blue Book for stabilization purposes, but most solar sites are going with other mixtures. A lot of them are doing pollinator-friendly mixes, and really that's up to the project landscape architect to identify whether the seed mix will provide the appropriate surface stabilization within the required time period based on the project's timeline. When are they stabilizing the site versus when are they trying to close out permit coverage or get into weather conditions where we expect that we need a stabilized surface. So that's something the registered landscape architect should be making a decision on.
All right. Next question is, how are we meant to handle time of concentration within the context of solar arrays that do not alter the site hydrology between pre and post development conditions? Decreasing the sheet flow distance to 100 feet for a sub area with no impervious cover proposed seems to be a case of fixing a problem that didn't exist in the first place.
Luke, can you speak to that one?
I think the question is saying decreasing the sheet flow distance in the existing condition, because normally you do like 150 feet, so that it's the same distance in the existing and post is fixing that problem that didn't exist in the first place. Right, because in our manual we say that you should use, assuming it's not a really flat site, you're using 150 in the existing condition and 100 in the post, and then that ends up having a longer time of concentration in the existing condition, and you can get sharper peak flows and an increase in discharge that doesn't really exist when we're going from meadow to meadow. So I think the question is maybe, or the inquirer is just maybe looking for confirmation that using the same flow path for the time of concentration in both the existing and post-development condition is acceptable. Whether that's 150, because that's what it was in the existing condition, or whether that's 100, what we would normally require in the developed condition. I mean, that's typically what I tell people to do. If there's no change to the surface cover, because we're going meadow to meadow, it's not going over an access road or other impervious areas, or it wasn't a forest beforehand or whatever, then you would want to make sure that it's essentially the same in both models.
All right, next question says, how should the limited use pervious access drive be modeled in post-developed conditions? would the land cover type be considered gravel road with CN of 96, or is there other recognized CN value that can be considered? And I'm not sure if Dave Sherman's responses to this question. I think it is.
No, Dave Sherman's is different.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah, okay, I see now.
Do you want to handle that one too?
Sure. So we typically recommend that people just, as a limited use pervious access drive, the idea is that the soil underneath is not compacted. We're not considering this to be an impervious surface, so we wouldn't consider it to be an impervious gravel road, right, where we have gravel compacted into dirt and it's all, it generates a hard surface that water runs off of. Here, the water is going to soak into or percolate through the gravel and then soak into the soil below. And we typically recommend that whatever curve number was there in the existing condition, use the same curve number in the developed condition. That when you are implementing the design as in that detail, this road is not going to contribute any additional runoff from the site. Frequently, when installed correctly, we actually see a decrease in runoff from the site, but it's not always installed correctly. So, it's just the general assumption is that you're going to assume that the road itself is not contributing any runoff, so you're going to use the same curve number.
Alrighty, and we have some follow-up on the question where we're asking for clarification on what they meant by stacked. They said stacking solar panels on the racking. It is my understanding that more than one panel can be stacked to get more production in a rack. If there is no space, there would be greater concentrated flow, and the gap or space would allow for more than one drip edge, reducing the concentrated flow.
Say that one more time, Ben.
Yeah, of course. I'm also trying to find the original question. So in reference to stacked panels, this person's clarifying, saying that stacking solar panels on the racking, it is my understanding that more than one panel can be stacked to get more production in a rack. If there's no space, there would be greater concentrated flow, and the gap or space would allow for more than one drip edge, reducing the concentrated flow.
Okay, so there's a couple of things here. Let me see if I can go back to, let me see if I'm gonna go back for a ways here, so just bear with me. If you look at the table or the figure that we have for here we go, our solar panel modules. We have taken into account gaps between the panels. So the solar, here's the solar table, and then the solar table is made up of individual solar modules or solar panels. So if the panel, if I'm envisioning what a stacked panel is like, it would be two or more solar tables together. But you're still going to have the gaps between the solar modules and panels. So when you're looking at this diagram here, past it, you would still look at the whole table width. Does that make sense? So if they're stacked, you would still look at the overall surface area to determine your inner row space.
Yes, can you go to the next slide, Julie?
Sure.
So in this photo, we can see a gap between two panels on one fixed tilt system. And having a gap there does allow water to run through that gap and create another drip edge, kind of like what they're talking about. And if the panels are along the contours, then this reduces the impact on the vegetation below the panels. And this can be, when we have kind of like you imagine a barn roof where all the water comes off on one drip edge, you can have the vegetation die right below the panel. So this can be beneficial in preventing any impacts to the vegetation growth from water running off the panels. However, once the vegetation is well established, this doesn't really do anything to change that the concentration of flow, right? It comes off the panel, it goes through the vegetation, and is assumed to be sheet flow at that point, and as it concentrates, it forms that shallow concentrated flow. When the panels are perpendicular to the slope, we can create erosion pathways along each of these drip edges, and that's typically where when we're on a slope and we have that water running down the slope because it's a little steep, and we have our gravel diaphragms or other devices to help break up those concentrated flows, we're going to have, we'll see those at each point. But in practice, this is helpful during construction to reduce the impacts on the vegetation being established below the panels.
All right, next question is, when calculating the time of concentration in the proposed condition and the flow route crosses a proposed gravel diaphragm, is there accepted increase in time of concentration for each time the path crosses the gravel diaphragm, as the flow will be slowed in this case?
Yeah, I'm gonna have to ask Luke for another.
I don't give anyone credit for this. We are restoring sheet flow. We don't have that, we're minimizing the shallow concentrated flow, but it isn't exactly going back to like square one, right? We still have more water at that point than we do in the initial like start of the uphill area of our drainage area. What I do recommend people do instead of working on that time of concentration calculation is just credit themselves the storage volume in the gravel diaphragms, right? Model those in HydroCAD and give yourself that storage, because that will help reduce the runoff, and depending on how you model it, may delay the discharge in the first place.
Okay, and the next question is, could you clarify when post-construction surface coverage should be modeled as meadow versus open in array areas?
I think they mean vegetated open space. I think those are synonymous in our mind.
All right, well, that brings us to the end of our questions in the chat. Oh, just kidding. Someone just posted another question. Going back to the 60-day review question, if gravel diaphragms and flow diffusers are being used to maintain sheet flow under panels for the steeper sites, which would allow the panels to not be considered traditional impervious cover, is the department saying that those project SWIPs would be subject to a 60-day review regardless? Or is the 60-day review only applicable if the panels are indeed considered traditional impervious cover sheet flow cannot be maintained where flow diffusers and gravel diaphragms are being used for WQV and RRV mitigation.
Deputy John, question?
Yeah, I'm reading it and trying to make sense of it.
What we said earlier, the 60-day review would only be triggered if the gravel diaphragms were being used for water quality volume and RRV mitigation, not for when they're being used to maintain sheet flow.
Right. So I think maybe Adam, official your question, feel free to send another one, but it seems like there's two aspects of if it's table 1 or table 2. Yeah, I guess so. Like the whole presentation today and the other table 1 or table 2, that doesn't kick us to 60-day. Only 60 days only when you are deviating from our standards and demonstrating equivalence. And so, like Luke was saying, if you're using that gravel diaphragm as a practice for water quality volume, then that would be a deviation and a 60-day review if you're outside of an MS4 operator review authority area.
All right, next we have, how should gravel diaphragms and flow diffusers be modeled? How should the time of concentration be altered to account for these features?
I think we talked about this just a couple questions ago. I don't recommend that the time of concentration be altered. Rather, I recommend that the storage in the gravel diaphragms be accounted for. Flow diffusers are a little different. You can model if you want to model the water bar that's collecting the storm water and sending it to a flow diffuser, and then modeling the flow coming out of the flow diffuser, you can. I've seen one site do that, but for gravel diaphragms, yeah, I just recommend modeling the storage in them.
Okay, next one is there any information in the 2024 design manual about using gravel diaphragms as storage in your proposed HydroCAD modeling?
The short answer would be no, right? There, because it's not, gravel diaphragms aren't a practice in the manual.
I mean, they're very similar to infiltration trenches. If you do infiltration testing, that would be the closest similar practice to look at if you're looking for sizing. However, the design manual doesn't really go through how to model because there's a bunch of different modeling softwares. Like we give a handful of examples, like generating your own storm event and stuff like that, but we don't go through how to model specific practices in general in the design manual. So I don't think that there's specific instructions.
Okay, does anybody else have other questions? I guess hearing and seeing none, that would bring us to the end.
Sorry, I was on mute there for a while.
You're
So
good.
I just want to take the time to say thank you to everyone for coming together. We're finishing up a little before noon. If John is going to make the presentation available for everyone. Thank you for your time and your patience going through your questions. And we hope you have a really good day.